My name is Ella Wagner. I'm a Women's History Fellow with the Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education at the Washington Support Office of the National Park Service. The 19th Amendment is the women's suffrage amendment, which basically removed all barriers based on sex, or what we usually call gender, in the Constitution to voting in the United States. So in effect, what that meant was that women who had previously been barred from voting because they were women, that was no longer allowed after the amendment was ratified in August of 1920. So the National Park Service cares about it because it's a really significant event in our country's history. It marks the triumph of a movement that had been going on for more than 100 years to get those legal barriers removed. It certainly was not the end of the story of women voting. There remained barriers to women voting based on race, based on tribal affiliation, based on national identity. So it was not the end of that story, but a really important milestone in this long journey to hopefully having full inclusion and participation by everyone who is in this country into its political system. So as an agency with a responsibility to share our history, even in places where you might not think that there's suffrage history, it's our responsibility to tell the story and to do it in as many ways and as many parks as possible.
My name is Jonathan Fairchild. I'm the historian here at Homestead National Monument of America. We talk about millions and millions of people over more than 120 years, this tremendous impact that the Homestead Act has had on American history in ways that a lot of people may not think of when they first think about homesteading and the Homestead Act. The 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920, guaranteed the right for women to vote, under that the right to vote should not be restricted based upon gender. And so we're talking about that story as it relates to homesteading and to homesteading women.
Part of that dream is the development of the West. And the development of the West is so entwined with the Homestead Act that you actually can't talk about one without the other. That dream of having your own land was so crucial to people moving to the West, even if they didn't farm, even if they were a shopkeeper or a banker or a lawyer or a teacher or something else. It still was that dream that there was going to be people there farming that land and making that land productive. It was going to support the towns and the communities and the other activities that happened. And so right from the start, as the West developed, which was, of course, the key battleground for women's rights, the East was hopeless. They already had laws that even predated the revolution that had been in place, traditions. They could see that nothing there was going to be new. But the West presented opportunities for things that could never happen, starting with land ownership. And of course, land ownership is so linked with the right to vote that women were always, of course, there in homesteading. Although there's that kind of image of, a young man strikes out to homestead. In point of fact, even those young men that went out and homesteaded on their own, the next thing they're writing to a sister, an aunt, a widowed mom and saying, can't you come out here? It's hard to be the one and only person trying to create a farm out of undeveloped land and then to go in at night and who's made supper? Who's taken care of that cabin that they had to build? So right from the start, the pattern is that you see a couple. Now I think that the excitement of discovering what about the women who filed in their own names, and what about those women who made this work when even a woman who had inherited land or had land through some other vehicle did not necessarily expect to be able to hold onto that land or to take care of the land on her own, let alone do what it took to homestead, which was really making something out of nothing. And I don't mean to disparage the land or anything that Native people or other people might have been doing because they had a different form of land management, but that creation of farms was just so much more work than what we think of. That there were women, there were always women there, not just the women that were the helpers along with the men, the women who were stepping up and saying, I can make this work for me.
The fact that women were able to claim land in their own name was huge. Between 100 and 200,000 women started choosing to homestead. And one of the phrases that many Americans remember from their school days, no taxation without representation, right? So these homesteading women, as they're proving up and receiving land in their own name, of course they have to pay taxes on it, but when it comes time to vote, they have no say in how these taxes are spent. They have no say in what is being done in their communities around them. And many women, as they're homesteading, obviously are taking issue with this, right? The link between homesteading and the suffrage movement is pretty clear when you look at when and where suffrage is being passed prior to the 19th Amendment.
When you think about states that were west of the Mississippi, and certainly states west of the Missouri, that was the West when you're sitting somewhere in the East. The other thing that people don't realize is, as I said, that they realized that they were not going to make progress in those eastern states. The power structure was just too entrenched. The traditions were too entrenched. But the West was a whole new opportunity, and Wyoming is the example that we point to, and we almost point to it sometimes as an anomaly. Look at how desperate those people were to be a state. They'd count everybody. They'd let anybody vote, even women. But we don't realize that Wyoming is the one that did what they were hoping all those other states would do. Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, when they came. The hope was that one after the other, that they would allow women to vote and influence the eastern states in the other direction. So these women who were advocates were actually out talking and speaking in the West much more than we realized, because they saw that as the great hope. They really thought if this was going to happen in the United States, it was going to happen because of the Western states, not because of that the people in the Eastern states were suddenly going to have a great revelation and change their minds about women voting.
Some of the women homesteaders actually become some of the most politically powerful women in the country at that point. You may be familiar with Jeanette Rankin, who was the daughter of women homesteaders. She was born on a homestead out in Montana to Canadian immigrants, and she reflected on her time growing up on the homestead that both men and women together had to put in intense, difficult, often back-breaking work. And as a young woman, Jeanette was pitching in with that hard work. But women, politically, without the right to the vote, they weren't benefiting in the same ways that male homesteaders were. And that was one of the things that spurred her to go into politics and fighting for women's rights. And she actually becomes the first woman in American history elected to federal office. She is elected a congressperson for Montana and has a couple of unique distinctions. She was the only woman in Congress at that point, so she was the only woman when the 19th Amendment was ratified, the only woman to, in Congress, be able to vote for that, and said that that was one of her proudest achievements. One of the homesteading suffragist leaders out in New Mexico was Adelina Otero Warren, who was a Latina suffragist and homesteader. She was born in New Mexico in the late 1800s and navigated this unique world of Latino and Latinas, of Anglos, of Native Americans. And when the suffrage movement wanted to create a chapter out in New Mexico, so Alice Paul, who led the Congressional Union at that time and became the National Women's Party, she was looking for a strong leader to head up the New Mexico chapter and recruit to the movement Latina and Latinas. And so they talked to Adelina, or Nina Otero Warren, and she made sure that all materials that the Congressional Union was putting out were available both in English and in Spanish because I wanted to be accessible. They'd give speeches in both languages, make sure that they were really reaching the whole state. And she actually ends up being the first Latina to run for federal office. She ran for Congress. It was a very close election, but she was defeated. And then she ends up claiming a homestead out in New Mexico under the Stock Raising Homestead Act. So she had a ranch with her friend and longtime business partner, Mamie Meadows. They homesteaded right next to each other, each got 640 acres, and affectionately named their ranch Las Dos, or the two women.
Hello, my name is Rachel Lauren, and I'm here at the Belmont Hall Women's Equality National Monument, located here in beautiful Washington, D.C.
The National Women's Party, originally known as the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, injected renewed vitality into the American suffrage campaign. Inspired by their British counterparts, but frustrated by lack of progress, founders Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and thousands of other women engaged in radical and oftentimes dangerous tactics to publicly challenge and persuade male politicians opposed to women's suffrage. Focused on securing a constitutional amendment to give women the vote, the National Women's Party demanded rights of women entitled as citizens. As the first American civil rights group to successfully use sustained, nonviolent resistance, the National Women's Party designated a campaign that combined traditional lobbying with innovative militant actions and set the stage for the next phase of women's equality movement in the United States.
The story of immigration and homesteading very closely tied together, and there's some fantastic stories of immigrant homesteaders in the suffrage movement. And one of those women is Maggie Waltz, who came to the United States from Finland as a young woman with almost nothing, just a few dollars in her pocket, didn't even speak the language. And so when she arrives in America, she goes to an area that was very heavily settled by Finns and by Swedes up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, an area that's referred to as the copper country, a lot of copper mining in that district. She moves to Calumet, Michigan, and she starts working odd jobs and starts making a place for herself. But one of the things that she does is she wants to be able to give back to the community.
If the size of our impact on our community was reflected by the size of our grave marker, Maggie J Waltz would have one of the largest gravestones here at Calumet's Lakeview Cemetery. Hi, I'm Ranger Lynette Weber at Keweenaw National Historical Park, and we tell the story of copper and community in Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula. The area is very well known for the impact of Finnish immigrants who came here beginning in the 19th century. They established a number of community assets, such as newspapers, clubs, cooperative societies, churches, and more. One of the most important founders and members of many of these groups was Maggie J Waltz, a fellow Finnish immigrant whose outsized personality and voice like a sea captain's, as was quoted in one newspaper, might seem outsized for her diminutive marker. Maggie, who anglicized her name, was a member of numerous organizations which met at the Finnish People's Enlightenment Society Hall here in Calumet. She was a founder of suffrage and temperance organizations which met here and was involved at a national and even international level. One of the things that these groups promoted was to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. And Maggie joined their ranks on April 20th, 1900, becoming one of the first women to be naturalized on her own accord here in Houghton County. She was likely thinking ahead to her future in homesteading and voting.
And one of the things she does, she actually becomes a land agent on Drummond Island, and she creates a homesteader colony, a settlement of largely ethnic Finns to settle and create their own Finnish community. It's the only Finnish language school. By the time it proves up, There are approximately 1,000 people in 5 different settlements on the island, and so she really has this amazing story. You know, suffrage, women's rights, uplift, economic opportunity. I think it's just fascinating. Between 1848 and 1920, you've got that 72-year period. I think it's pretty clear to see that homesteaders are really leading the charge. They're leading the way. And I say that the suffrage movement and the 19th Amendment, in many ways, were planted in the soil. These homesteading women, they're the ones that are leading the charge. It's these western and midwestern states where it happens first and set the stage for the 19th Amendment, for that race to ratification that we're celebrating right now.